Hands up. Don't move. The sharp command sliced through the evening air, making Jasmine Ellis freeze in her tracks. Just moments ago, she had been walking home, thinking about her future at Columbia University. Now, she was staring down the barrels of police guns, accused of a crime she didn't commit. Her heart pounded. She wanted to explain, to show them her ID, to tell them the truth. But the look in their eyes told her it wouldn't matter. And when they found the badge in her bag, the one with the CIA emblem, everything took a turn no one saw coming. What happened next would shake the entire system. Stay tuned because this story is one you won't believe. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. At 18, Jasmine Ellis was finishing her senior year at Langston Hughes Academy with top honors. She had just been accepted to Columbia University on a generous scholarship, her dream college, located right in the heart of New York City. It was early April, and she had plans to celebrate her acceptance with her mother that evening. Maybe even treat Angela to dinner at a local family restaurant. On that fateful afternoon, Jasmine left school later than usual, having stayed behind for an emergency meeting of the debate club. She took the usual bus, the M5, which zigzagged through some of the busiest streets in Upper Manhattan. Jasmine always carried a backpack filled with thick textbooks, physics, calculus, U.S. government, and a separate pouch that held her laptop. Nestled discreetly within a hidden compartment of that pouch was a small ID badge. The name on it read Jasmine Ellis, and the emblem etched in the corner was the unmistakable crest of the CIA. She had been given the badge only a few months prior, a final step before she'd be fully enrolled in an extended training program the following summer. The bus ride was uneventful, just a sleepy array of students, office workers, and exhausted parents heading home. Jasmine stepped off near Harlem, intending to walk the remaining few blocks. It was almost dusk, the sky tinted with pinkish orange as the sun descended beyond the horizon. That's when it happened. A sudden commotion around the corner. 3 police cars had converged in front of the rundown corner store Jasmine often passed on her way home. Their lights flashed in harsh reds and blues, painting the alleyway in strobing, disorienting color. Jasmine felt her stomach knot. She sensed that something was off. Even from a distance, she recognized the tension in the officers' postures. Their voices rose in angry shouts. Although Jasmine couldn't make out the words from where she stood, she cautiously tried to skirt around the commotion. But before she could disappear behind the next block, a voice yelled, "Hey you! Stop right there!" She froze, uncertain if the shout was directed at her. A second call confirmed it. "You, girl in the hoodie, hands up!" Jasmine's heart hammered. She wasn't wearing anything out of the ordinary. A worn black hoodie, jeans, her backpack slung over one shoulder. This was standard Jasmine attire. Still, fear pulsed through her. She lifted her hands slowly, her eyes darting around to see if there was anyone else who might intervene. A couple of onlookers stood at a distance, recording the unfolding scene on their phones. 2 police officers approached, their hands already on the grips of their sidearms. The older officer, whose name tag read O'Donnell, glared at her. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine's voice trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. I'm just heading home. I live a few blocks away." The younger officer, labeled Marston, interjected. "We're looking for suspects in a robbery that took place earlier today. You match the description." Confusion washed over Jasmine. She couldn't imagine how she could match any description. She'd been in school all day, and plenty of classmates and teachers could vouch for her whereabouts. "But don't argue," Officer O'Donnell snapped. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Panic clawed at her chest. Jasmine wanted to assert her rights, but she remembered her mother's warnings about dealing with the police. "Keep your voice steady. Don't make sudden moves. Don't argue, or they might consider you a threat." She nodded mutely. Marston yanked Jasmine's arms behind her back, slapping cuffs on her wrists, tighter than necessary. As Jasmine winced, O'Donnell launched into a quick search of her backpack. He rummaged through her physics textbook, her lunch container, her notebook riddled with debate club notes. Then, he found the laptop pouch and pried it open. His brow creased at the sight of Jasmine's CIA internship badge. "What is this?" he demanded, holding up the small ID card like it was contraband. Jasmine's brain scrambled. She wanted to keep her internship quiet, as per the confidentiality agreement. But right now, it was the only thing that might help prove she wasn't some random suspect. It's a government internship ID, she said softly. Officer O'Donnell let out a snort. Don't insult our intelligence, he growled. This is some fake badge you had printed. Think you're clever? Before Jasmine could respond, O'Donnell slammed the pouch shut, pocketing the badge. We'll check this out at the station, he muttered. As Jasmine was shoved into the back of a squad car, tears welled up in her eyes. She knew this was bad. Very bad. Her mother would be worried sick, and Jasmine's worst fear was that she'd end up another statistic. Another name on a long list of people of color unfairly detained or harmed by law enforcement. She could already imagine the headlines, though no one would care enough to print them. Promising honor student charged in robbery. The officer slammed the door, the sound echoing in Jasmine's chest like a judge's gavel. She tried to breathe, tried to stay calm, telling herself this was some horrible misunderstanding. Surely, it would be resolved once they checked her school attendance records or spoke with her teachers. But as the squad car pulled away, Jasmine saw the future she dreamed of. Columbia University, the CIA internship, her entire life plan, dangling precariously, about to slip right through her fingers. Jasmine sat on a cold metal bench at the precinct. Her cheeks damp with tears, she tried to wipe away with her shoulder, since her hands were cuffed behind her back. Officer O'Donnell and Officer Marston were in and out, sometimes sneering at her as they walked by. Other times, they said nothing at all, ignoring her presence entirely. She had no idea what was happening on the other side of that locked door. Whether they were actually searching for evidence of her involvement in the alleged robbery or simply stalling. In the back of her mind, Jasmine clung to the hope that eventually, they'd let her make a phone call. She repeated her mother's number in her head, a mantra she'd known since she could first speak. 917-555-3284. She could recite it in her sleep. Finally, an officer she hadn't seen before, an older black woman named Detective Morgan, entered the holding area. She looked Jasmine over, eyes flickering with something that might have been empathy. All right, Miss Ellis, let's get you processed, Detective Morgan said quietly, reaching into her pocket for a key. Jasmine breathed a tiny sigh of relief when the cuffs were removed, so she could be fingerprinted and photographed. The fluorescent lights overhead made everything feel surreal, as if Jasmine was stuck in a nightmare. She tried to form words, to ask if she could call her mother, but the knot in her throat made it hard. Detective Morgan must have sensed Jasmine's distress, because she gestured to a phone on a nearby desk. After we finish here, I'll let you make a call. Those few words were like a lifeline. Jasmine nodded, blinking back tears. She could still feel the stares from some of the officers standing around. It wasn't lost on her that she was young, black, and female, and that for too many law enforcement personnel, that alone was enough to cast suspicion. Once the fingerprinting was done, Jasmine was escorted to a phone. Detective Morgan stood nearby, discreetly out of earshot. Jasmine dialed home, heart thudding with anxiety. On the fourth ring, Angela answered. Hello? Mom. Jasmine's voice cracked as soon as she heard her mother's voice. They arrested me. She could hear Angela's gasp. Arrested? Jasmine, what on earth happened? Where are you? Jasmine's explanation tumbled out in halting bursts. The store. The police. The false accusation. Angela cut her off, not angrily, but urgently. Stay calm. I'm on my way. I'll call Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein was an old family friend, a local lawyer with a small practice who had helped the Ellis family with legal matters before. The call ended, but Jasmine felt marginally better knowing help was coming. Over the next few hours, Jasmine was questioned by Officer O'Donnell and Officer Marston. They insisted they had an eyewitness who claimed someone matching Jasmine's description had been acting suspiciously near the convenience store earlier in the day. They also pointed to her presence near the scene as evidence of potential involvement. Jasmine explained, time and again, that she was at school during the alleged robbery, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Each time she tried to bring up her perfect attendance record, or mention that her teachers could confirm her whereabouts, the officers would scoff or roll their eyes. They also mocked her supposed fake CIA badge. No matter what Jasmine said, it felt like sinking into quicksand. Every explanation was met with hostility and disbelief. By midnight, Jasmine was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Detective Morgan came by with a small packet of chips and a bottle of water. She wordlessly handed them to Jasmine. Though Jasmine was grateful, she couldn't ignore the sense that Morgan, too, believed Jasmine was just another teenage delinquent. Perhaps the detective was simply more polite about it. Shortly after, Mr. Klein arrived, accompanied by Angela. Jasmine had never been so relieved to see two familiar faces. Angela looked frantic, her usually neat braids frizzy at the edges, her eyes rimmed with the remnants of tears. She rushed to Jasmine, arms opening to hug her, only to be gently stopped by a uniformed officer. Jasmine gave her mother a tight, shaky smile from a distance. Mr. Klein stepped forward. He was a middle-aged white man with a kind, intelligent demeanor. He introduced himself to Detective Morgan, then turned to Jasmine. "Don't say anything else without me present." He whispered it firmly. Jasmine nodded, grateful for the guidance. Mr. Klein demanded to see the evidence they had against Jasmine. Officer O'Donnell offered vague references to the so-called eyewitness. Mr. Klein asked to see the footage from the store's security cameras. The officers claimed it was being reviewed, but Jasmine suspected they were stalling because it wouldn't show her at all. Eventually, Jasmine was placed under formal arrest, charged with suspicion of robbery, scheduled for arraignment in a few days. The gravity of that moment struck Jasmine with physical force. She had never felt so powerless. Her mother's arms finally unfolded her, and Jasmine broke down in sobs. She knew, in that moment, she was entering a labyrinth of legal troubles she did not deserve. Detective Morgan escorted Jasmine to a cell, apologetically. Because Jasmine was technically an adult by just a few months, she was placed in a holding cell with other adult female detainees, some of whom eyed her curiously. Jasmine sank onto a bench, arms hugging her own chest in a vain attempt to protect herself. She kept thinking about the CIA badge. If she could just speak to someone high enough in the agency to confirm her internship status, maybe all of this could be cleared up. But Jasmine also recalled the secrecy agreements she had signed. Would the agency even acknowledge her involvement? Would they protect her? Or would they distance themselves? As the steel door clanged shut, Jasmine stared at the peeling paint on the far wall, her stomach churning. She wasn't just worried about the legal ramifications. She was worried about the future she'd worked so hard to build. A moment of dread flickered through her mind. Perhaps her acceptance to Columbia could be revoked if she ended up with a criminal record. Or the CIA might terminate her internship in order to avoid bad publicity. So many nightmares spun through her mind, and none of them ended well. Jasmine tried to rest, but each time she drifted off, she would jerk awake to the sound of keys rattling or other detainees shuffling. Her mother's tearful face floated in her thoughts, fueling Jasmine's own tears, though she tried hard not to cry in front of strangers. She wondered if tomorrow would bring the exoneration she so desperately prayed for, or if it would only tighten the noose around her neck. Jasmine found herself in the back seat of a sheriff's van, hands cuffed in front of her, en route to the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan for her arraignment. The building itself had always struck her as grand and imposing. She remembered passing by it on field trips, or while exploring the city with her mother. Now, she was approaching it in shackles. Her mother and Mr. Klein had fought to get her bail set, but the judge at the preliminary hearing seemed unconvinced by Jasmine's protestations of innocence, particularly since the prosecution, represented by an assistant district attorney who seemed oddly aggressive, argued Jasmine was a flight risk due to her questionable government ID. The result? Jasmine spent 2 nights in county lockup, a harrowing experience for an 18-year-old who had done nothing wrong. During that time, Jasmine overheard passing comments about the 2 arresting officers, O'Donnell and Marston. Some of the older detainees whispered that these officers had a history of roughing up suspects and falsifying reports, particularly in cases that involved young black men and women in New York City. Jasmine felt a new kind of anger settle over her. She vowed that if she ever got out of this mess, she would do everything in her power to expose whatever corruption lay beneath the surface. Mr. Klein visited Jasmine in jail. "I requested surveillance footage from the convenience store," he told her in a low voice through the security glass. They claim the footage isn't available because the cameras were out of service. Jasmine's stomach dropped. That's a lie, she said flatly. Of course it is, Klein agreed. But we'll keep digging. There must be some other way to prove your alibi. Jasmine nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. My school records, she said. They'll show I was in class. Klein nodded. That's next on my list. I have your attendance log. We have statements from your teachers, your debate team, the bus driver. If we can get them to talk. He sighed. The problem is, the prosecution is leaning heavily on an eyewitness account. We'll have to discredit that, or prove the witness is mistaken or lying. Jasmine leaned her forehead against the glass. I'm just scared, she admitted. What if that's not enough? Klein's gaze was sympathetic. We'll do everything we can. Hang in there. As she neared the federal courthouse, Jasmine couldn't help but notice the swarm of local reporters with cameras stationed near the entrance. She overheard a deputy mention something about a high-profile case also on the docket that day, a big political scandal that had drawn major media attention. Jasmine fervently hoped no one would care enough to point their cameras at her. The last thing she wanted was to become a media spectacle. She was led into a sterile hallway, where she waited with other detainees for their turn in front of the judge. Her mother was in the gallery. Jasmine knew Mr. Klein would be beside her as soon as they stepped into the courtroom. Jasmine tried to steady her breathing, going over the facts in her head, like a debate rehearsal. She imagined bullet points. I was at school all day. I have witnesses, teachers, students, staff. The store's cameras should show I wasn't there. The CIA internship ID is real, not fake. Yet, she couldn't ignore the horrifying possibility that her CIA affiliation might never be confirmed publicly. If the agency decided to keep her at arm's length, Jasmine had no way of forcing them to speak up. She was on her own. Unless the agency decided otherwise. Jasmine was escorted into the courtroom, heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone could hear it. She glanced around, spotting her mother in the first row, eyes swollen from crying but resolute, hands clasped in her lap. Mr. Klein nodded at Jasmine in silent encouragement. The judge, a stern-faced woman with a commanding presence, asked Jasmine to approach with her counsel. The assistant district attorney, Ms. Branson, an ambitious woman in her late 30s, wasted no time. She began laying out the charges. The defendant, Jasmine Ellis, is accused of participating in an armed robbery at the convenience store on 145th and Malcolm X Boulevard. An eyewitness placed her at the scene, and she was found fleeing the vicinity shortly after the crime took place. We request that the charges move forward and that bail remain denied, given the suspicious nature of the government ID found on her person. Jasmine's pulse roared in her ears. The words armed robbery made her stomach churn. She had never touched a gun in her life. This was madness. Mr. Klein stepped forward, clear-voiced and resolute. Your Honor, this is a grave misunderstanding. My client maintains her innocence. She was in school for the entire day, engaged in supervised activities. We have more than a dozen individuals willing to testify to that fact. Furthermore, the ID Ms. Ellis carries is not a fake. She is enrolled in a legitimate government internship, which can be verified. Ms. Branson raised an eyebrow. She shifted her gaze from Mr. Klein to Jasmine. Verified by whom? The defendant refuses to name the contact who provided this so-called CIA badge. Jasmine's stomach clenched. She had tried to tell the officers about her CIA contact, a liaison named Ms. Harrington, who oversaw the high potential outreach program. But Ms. Harrington had made Jasmine sign documents stating she would never reveal program specifics without prior agency approval. Jasmine had called Ms. Harrington from jail, but only got her voicemail. She left one desperate, whispered message, hoping someone in the agency would step up. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. I will not deny this is an unusual situation. However, Ms. Ellis is only 18, has no prior record, and appears to have strong ties to this community. I'm inclined to grant bail if the defense can provide some credible verification of her identity and internship. Mr. Klein cleared his throat. We request a small recess, Your Honor, so that we may gather additional verification. The judge considered for a moment. Very well. We'll reconvene in 2 days. Jasmine exhaled sharply. Jasmine was escorted out of the courtroom, tears burning her eyes. She had been so close to getting released, yet she was still locked in a cage. Her mother tried to rush forward, but security held her back. Jasmine felt her heart sink further. She was stuck for another 2 days. Jasmine rested her head in her hands, trying to block out the humiliating clangs of the jail cell gate. She had to find a way to get someone from the CIA to intervene. She worried that the agency wouldn't want to bring public attention to a minor operative or an intern with minimal clearance. Would they come forward? Or would they pretend she never existed? That night, a guard woke Jasmine up. "You have a visitor." Jasmine rubbed her eyes, confused. She was led into the visitation room. Behind the plexiglass sat a woman in a crisp navy suit, her hair in a tight bun. Jasmine's eyes widened in recognition. Ms. Harrington, her CIA liaison. Jasmine quickly slid into the seat and lifted the phone receiver. "Ms. Harrington." Ms. Harrington's voice was subdued. "I just heard what happened. I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner." Jasmine pressed her free hand to the glass. "Thank God you came." Her voice cracked. "They think I robbed that store. They won't believe my ID is real. They're charging me with armed robbery. Please, you have to help me." Ms. Harrington nodded slowly. "I'm going to do what I can. This is a delicate matter. I've been authorized to confirm your internship to the judge, but that's about it. This isn't how we like to handle such issues, but given the circumstances, your freedom is more important." She paused, scanning Jasmine's weary face. "You should never have been arrested in the first place." Jasmine exhaled slowly, tears of relief threatening to spill. She wanted to grab Ms. Harrington's hand, but the plexiglass barrier made that impossible. "Thank you," she whispered. "Please hurry." Jasmine was informed that Ms. Harrington had provided a formal affidavit verifying Jasmine's involvement in the CIA's high potential outreach program. She even included Jasmine's acceptance letter, redacting sensitive content. With that affidavit, Mr. Klein demanded an emergency hearing. The judge, swayed by the official documentation, granted Jasmine bail. The moment Jasmine emerged onto the courthouse steps, her mother enveloped her in a hug so fierce it took Jasmine's breath away. Reporters, still lingering from the high-profile political case, snapped pictures of Jasmine and her mother. Jasmine kept her head down. She just wanted to go home, take a hot shower, sleep in her own bed. But even as she walked away with Angela, Jasmine knew it wasn't over. She had to return for a full hearing. The official trial was scheduled for the following week. Jasmine sat on their worn living room couch. Mr. Klein was seated across from her and Angela. A stack of paperwork spread out on the coffee table. Angela offered Mr. Klein a cup of coffee, and he accepted with a tired smile. The prosecution is building their entire case on this alleged eyewitness, plus the fact that Jasmine was near the store at the time. We'll counter with Jasmine's school attendance, statements from teachers, and the fact that she only got off the bus near the store that day by coincidence. We show the time logs from the bus route, the sign-out sheet from her debate meeting, everything. We'll also emphasize Ms. Harrington's affidavit proving Jasmine's CIA internship is real. That defuses the argument that her ID was fake. The store cameras were allegedly broken, so there's no direct video evidence. That makes the eyewitness even more important. If we can discredit them, the prosecution's case might collapse. Jasmine listened intently, her eyes flicking between Mr. Klein and her mother. Angela squeezed Jasmine's hand in moral support. Jasmine's heart pounded at the thought of going through an actual trial, with testimonies and cross-examinations. But she knew it was her only shot to clear her name. Her CIA affiliation. The agency had helped get her out on bail, but Jasmine didn't know how much they would do beyond that. Ms. Harrington had told her to keep the badge hidden from the media, if at all possible. But Jasmine had a feeling that once she took the stand, everything would be laid bare. But despite the fear, Jasmine felt a surge of resolve. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom now. She was fighting for her future, for the principle that justice should not be so easily derailed by prejudice. She also knew that O'Donnell and Marston had to be held accountable for their actions. Though she was uncertain how to proceed on that front, Jasmine vowed not to let it slide. Once she cleared her name, she would fight back. Jasmine woke up that morning, heart fluttering like a trapped bird. She dressed in a simple navy blouse and black pants, her mother fussing over her hair to make sure every curl was neatly in place. The entire ride to the courthouse was silent, save for Jasmine's shaky breathing and Angela's anxious fiddling with the edges of her purse. Jasmine spotted the same gaggle of reporters. They seemed more focused on the continuing political scandal, but a few recognized her. The tabloids had already run with the sensational headline, "Teen CIA impersonator?" Flashes went off. Jasmine instinctively ducked her head, pressing forward into the building. Mr. Klein greeted them in the hallway. "Ready?" he asked, though he could see the fear in Jasmine's eyes. She nodded, swallowing hard. The three of them entered the courtroom. It was moderately full. Jasmine glimpsed Miss Harrington, seated unobtrusively in the back. That alone gave Jasmine a sliver of reassurance. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Once seated, Ms. Branson wasted no time. She gave a confident opening statement, portraying Jasmine as a cunning young woman who had lied about her government credentials, exploited her youth to evade suspicion, orchestrated a robbery that netted thousands. Then, she called Officer O'Donnell to testify. This trial would decide her fate. She had to prove her innocence and expose the corruption before it was too late. Jasmine sat rigidly as Officer O'Donnell took the stand. His expression was smug, his uniform neatly pressed, as if he hadn't ripped apart her life just days ago. Ms. Branson, the assistant district attorney, stood with calculated confidence. "Officer O'Donnell, please recount the events of the evening in question." O'Donnell cleared his throat and leaned forward. "We were responding to a robbery call at the convenience store on 145th and Malcolm X Boulevard. We arrived on the scene, and upon canvassing the area, we spotted the defendant," he gestured toward Jasmine, "loitering near the crime scene in a black hoodie, acting nervous. When we attempted to engage with her, she hesitated before raising her hands, as if concealing something." Jasmine's fists clenched under the table. She hadn't hesitated. She had been scared out of her mind. "And what happened next?" Branson prompted. "We detained her for questioning, and upon searching her backpack, we found this." O'Donnell reached into a plastic evidence bag and pulled out her CIA badge. "A fraudulent government ID." The courtroom murmured. Jasmine could feel eyes on her. O'Donnell continued. "When confronted, she couldn't provide a clear explanation for why she had it, which led us to believe she had been using it to commit fraud or deception. Given that she matched the general description of the suspect, we took her into custody for further questioning." Jasmine felt rage bubbling in her chest. He was twisting everything. She hadn't hesitated. She had told them the badge was real. They hadn't even listened. When Branson finished, Mr. Klein rose. His demeanor calm, but his eyes sharp. "Officer O'Donnell, let's clarify a few things. Did my client attempt to run?" O'Donnell shifted slightly. "Not exactly, but she was hesitant." "So, she didn't flee the scene?" Klein cut in smoothly. "She complied with your orders?" O'Donnell's jaw tightened. "Yes, but—" "Thank you." Moving on. Klein walked toward the jury, speaking as he moved. "You claim my client was acting nervous. But tell me, officer, do you often approach teenage girls with your guns drawn?" O'Donnell faltered. "Given the situation, a robbery had already occurred, correct?" "Yes." "And you had no evidence that my client was inside the store, correct?" O'Donnell stiffened. "She matched a description." "What description?" Branson objected. "The suspect description isn't the officer's responsibility." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled. The witness will answer." O'Donnell's face darkened. The description given was a young black female in dark clothing. Klein raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" O'Donnell hesitated. "There were other details. And yet, you arrested my client solely because she was black and wearing a hoodie." Branson objected again. Argumentative. The judge nodded. "Rephrase, Mr. Klein." Klein paced slowly, then stopped. "Officer, did you check my client's school records before detaining her?" "No, we." "Did you ask her teachers where she was?" "Not immediately, no." "Did you check security footage?" O'Donnell shifted uncomfortably. "It was unavailable." "But you didn't know that at the time of her arrest, did you?" "No." Klein turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer O'Donnell detained my client without evidence, ignored her alibi, and dismissed her CIA credentials as fake, without even attempting to verify them. Next, Branson called Travis Brown, the alleged eyewitness. Jasmine studied him carefully as he took the stand. He was a middle-aged man, dressed in a rumpled button-down, his eyes shifting nervously. Branson approached. "Mr. Brown, can you describe what you saw?" Brown swallowed hard. "I saw her." He nodded toward Jasmine. "She ran out of the store right after the alarm sounded." Jasmine felt her stomach churn. He was lying. Branson nodded. "And you're certain it was her?" "Absolutely. No further questions." Branson sat down. Jasmine gritted her teeth. Mr. Klein was up next. Klein approached slowly, flipping through some papers. "Mr. Brown, what were you doing in the area at the time?" Brown hesitated. "I was on a smoke break. I work at Goodwin's garage down the street." Klein flipped a page. "Goodwin's garage is closed on Mondays." A murmur spread through the gallery. Brown's face paled. "I must have messed up the day." "You mean you weren't actually there?" Brown shifted in his seat, his hands fidgeting. Branson sat rigidly, watching as her case crumbled. Then came the final blow. Mr. Klein pulled out a transcript of a recorded statement, Brown's initial police report. "Mr. Brown, in your original statement, you never mentioned my client. But today, you're suddenly certain? Or," Klein's voice turned sharp, "did someone coach you?" Brown froze. The room was silent. A bead of sweat ran down his forehead. Then, I don't know what I saw." The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "The eyewitness testimony is unreliable. The defendant's school records confirm her alibi. Additionally, her government ID has been officially verified." She exhaled sharply. "In the absence of credible evidence, this case is dismissed." Jasmine gasped, barely believing the words. Her mother let out a sob of relief. Mr. Klein patted her shoulder. "It's over." As Jasmine prepared to leave the courtroom, she noticed O'Donnell and Marston standing near the elevator, speaking urgently with Branson. Their faces were grim. Her mind flashed back to what she'd heard in jail. These officers had done this before. Planting false witnesses, falsifying evidence, destroying lives. Mr. Klein noticed her staring. He touched her arm gently. "It might be worth looking into," he murmured. Jasmine nodded. She filed it away in her mind. She wouldn't forget. As she stepped onto the courthouse steps, a reporter shouted, "Miss Ellis, how does it feel to be free?" Jasmine paused, choosing her words carefully. Then she said, "It's not just about me. It's about everyone they've done this to." And in that moment, she knew what she had to do next. Jasmine couldn't sleep that night. She was home, safe in her own bed, but her mind was racing. She kept thinking about the officers, the false witness, the fact that they had nearly destroyed her life, and no one would have questioned it if she didn't have the CIA internship to back her up. What about the others? The people without airtight alibis? The ones who weren't believed? The ones who never got out? She sat up, staring at the ceiling, a decision settling in her bones. She wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, Jasmine and her mother sat across from Mr. Klein in his small law office. A stack of papers sat between them, official documents, police reports, legal forms. "Are you sure about this?" Mr. Klein asked. "Absolutely." Jasmine's voice was steady. Angela sighed but nodded. "If we do this," Klein said, leaning forward, "it won't be easy. You're talking about taking legal action against 2 officers and the entire NYPD. The police union will fight back. The city will try to protect itself." "I don't care." Jasmine's jaw clenched. "O'Donnell and Marston did this to me, and I know they've done it to others. If we don't stop them, they'll do it again." Klein studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then we file the complaint." Detective Morgan, the only officer who had treated Jasmine with any dignity, reached out. They met at a small coffee shop away from prying eyes. Morgan stirred her black coffee, then spoke in a low voice. "You should know, I've been keeping tabs on O'Donnell and Marston for a while now. You weren't the first." Jasmine's stomach turned. "How many?" Morgan hesitated, then pulled out a notebook. She flipped it open, revealing a list of names. Jasmine scanned it. At least 10 people, 10 cases, 10 lives. She swallowed hard. They target easy marks, Morgan said. Young black men, immigrants, kids with minor records, people they know can't fight back. But why? Jasmine asked. Morgan sighed. The department pushes crime stats. Officers who clean up the streets get promotions, bonuses, respect. O'Donnell and Marston figured out how to game the system. If they need an arrest, they'll manufacture one. Jasmine's hands balled into fists under the table. How do we stop them? Morgan looked her in the eye. We gather evidence. We go public. And if we're lucky, we take them down. Jasmine and Morgan worked with Klein, reaching out to other victims. Some were too afraid to come forward. Others jumped at the chance to finally be heard. One by one, they pieced together a pattern of misconduct. False arrests, fabricated witnesses, excessive force, and then a breakthrough. A man named Luis Ortega, arrested by O'Donnell and Marston 6 months ago, agreed to talk. They planted drugs on me, he told them. I didn't stand a chance. He had been forced into a plea deal, 6 months in Rikers. Jasmine felt sick. 1 week later, Jasmine and Klein held a press conference outside the courthouse. We are filing a civil rights lawsuit against officers O'Donnell and Marston for wrongful arrest, falsifying evidence, and abuse of power, Klein announced to the cameras. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice strong. I got lucky, she said. I had proof. I had people who believed me. But how many others didn't? This is bigger than me. This is about justice. The press ate it up. Her story spread. And the NYPD? They were forced to respond. Days later, O'Donnell and Marston were placed on administrative leave. A formal investigation was opened. And then, the final blow. Travis Brown, the false eyewitness, came forward. In a plea deal, he admitted O'Donnell and Marston had paid him to testify against Jasmine. The case against them collapsed. 2 months after Jasmine's exoneration, she got a call from Morgan. Turn on the news. She did. And there they were. O'Donnell and Marston, in handcuffs, arrested for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and falsifying reports. Jasmine exhaled shakily. It was over. Justice had finally been served. With the lawsuit settled, Jasmine finally focused on her future. Her acceptance to Columbia was secure. Her CIA internship resumed. She spent her last weeks at home packing her belongings, reflecting on everything that had happened. One evening, her phone rang. It was Ms. Harrington. How are you holding up? Jasmine smiled. Better. I still can't believe it's all over. Harrington's voice held a note of pride. You took on an entire system, and you won. That's impressive. Jasmine glanced at her CIA badge, running her thumb over the emblem. So, does this mean I still have a future here? Harrington chuckled. Let's just say Langley is always looking for people who don't back down from a fight. The day Jasmine moved into her dorm at Columbia, she took a moment to herself. She walked to the campus library, breathing in the cool night air. She had faced the impossible. She had won. And she wasn't done yet. She had more battles to fight, more systems to challenge. She had a future to build, one where justice wasn't a privilege, but a right, and she would make sure of it.